Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. So, why is it so common to see relationships in organizations where there's a parent-child dynamic? What are the different games that people play in relationships in organizations, and why does it occur, and what can we do about it? So, to help us answer this question and many more about the fascinating world of transactional analysis and its 60-year history, we've invited the very engaging James Longwell to join us. James is an organization development consultant at Google, and we'll be exploring his practice and his approach to organization development that is involved working for some of the world's most fascinating organizations. Now, James has been at Google for 9 years. Often we have to introduce an organization, but Google is an organization that requires no introduction. But in addition to those 9 years at Google, James has a rich experience across different sectors, working for organizations that play a key role in our everyday lives. And these include things like NBC Universal, Britvic, Drinks, Cadbury's, Schweppes, and Peugeot. And he's got extensive international experience as well across 3 different geographies: UK, Europe, Asia, and Australasia. And to underpin his many sort of experiences, he's got lots of professional qualifications. And one of the main things we'll be talking about today is that he's a certified organizational transactional analyst. And we're fascinated about this. We have lots of questions. And finally, James is a chartered FCIPD. So he's a chartered fellow of our membership body, the CIPD. So James, thank you so much for making time. We know you're really busy, and thank you for joining us today.
It's an absolute pleasure, and thank you for inviting me on.
Welcome, James. Lovely to have you with us. So just to kick us off, just tell us a bit more about your role. What does that involve?
Well, I mean, I have 2 roles. So let me start, first of all, with my Google role. And I want to say right from the offset, obviously informed by Google PR, that I am speaking for myself and not as a spokesperson for Google here. So I really want to emphasize that in this conversation. So I have been in various guises working in organization development in Google over the past 9 years. And I've worked with many different parts of Google. So in the engineering function, in the cloud business, in the ad sales business, supporting our enabling functions. And I've also worked across geographies in the Europe, Middle East, and Africa region, as well as working on some global projects. So I've seen Google from many, many different angles, and I'm sure we'll get into what exactly do we mean by OD at Google. The other role that I have, though, is in the world of transactional analysis, as Garen introduced myself. And there I have the title of Provisional Teaching and Supervising Transactional Analyst. I didn't go for this just because I wanted a bunch of alphabet soup letters. It does actually stand for something. And as Garen mentioned, I'm a certified transactional analyst. That's the first stage of our qualification process, where you've done a certain amount of professional education, a certain amount of supervision, a certain amount of development. And then once you reach that level, you can then choose to go on and get a provisional teaching and supervising license, which allows you to formally teach transactional analysis and also supervision, which is what I'm doing now.
Fabulous. And what was it that inspired you to get into transactional analysis? Where did that spark of interest come from?
So actually, it was my very first graduate job. So way back in the mists of time, I joined Peugeot. And in the way that they did for graduate trainees, I joined as a graduate trainee in HR. That's where I started my professional career. They had a professional development program. And one of the very first modules was about communication. And in that communication module, I was introduced to something which are called ego states, which is a way of thinking about personality, which I can say more about later.
Yeah.
The idea and the concept really, really resonated with me. And then over the years, I got informally exposed to it until eventually I decided, actually, I really want to formalize and go deeper on my education and understanding there. So I began formal training in 2013. And then ever since then, I've been following a kind of a pathway of continuing development, which I know is one of the questions you want to ask me later.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah.
Definitely, we want to know.
Yeah. So we might have some people listening who don't really understand transactional analysis. Can you just give us kind of a brief summary of what it is and what it involves?
Yeah. And I really want to acknowledge, I mean, you've heard me stumble on the words twice. It is a phenomenally difficult expression. And actually, that in some ways can be attributed back to the humor of the founder. So the founder of transactional analysis was someone called Eric Byrne. He had a wicked sense of humor, and he sort of rejected the kind of the prevailing psychoanalytical establishment. He wanted to create a psychology that was more accessible, more about the kind of the humanity, more that allowed everyone to be able to communicate and talk. And whilst his initial work was very much focused on the field of psychotherapy, or kind of what we would also call clinical work, very shortly afterwards, people around him who were also learning and developing transactional analysis realized it could be applied in a whole bunch of contexts. So organizations, educational systems, counseling, a whole variety of kind of any walk of life, basically, any profession it could be applied to. So it is an accessible social human psychology, and a lot of it is based upon visual ideas, or being able to communicate things visually, and the use of simple metaphors which have a lot of depth in theory underneath. That's something I would want to dispel right up front. Some in the 60s and 70s, it did get a reputation as being a pop psychology, but actually it's a really robust psychology with academic underpinning and all that sort of stuff. But it spans the theoretical and the academic to the very pragmatic. And I think, honestly, that's why I like it.
And how might it show up in an organization? Like how might you know that there's the potential need for an intervention using this?
Well, I have to say, transactional analysis is applicable in any field of life, in any kind of situation. And the reason for that is that the very sort of starting point of transactional analysis was to look at exchanges of information between two individuals, hence the transaction. It's a transaction back and forth between you or I, and then the analysis of the transaction. So in any conversation between two or more individuals, you can analyze the transactions, and you can watch for the patterns, and you can see, are the transactions adult, which would be a way of characterizing these are done in full awareness with all of my thinking abilities. We're able to withstand disagreements. We're able to get to a productive place, versus perhaps being in parent or child, which we might call archaic ego states, where we might be more informed by either a significant authority figure from our past, which would be parent ego state, or child, which would be like a childhood experience or memory. Now, I'm trying to do something justice, which we could take a whole 2 days to teach. So if people are curious, there's lots of resources online where people can check out transactional analysis and discover a bit more.
Yeah, and I guess it's a really useful lens to make sense of things, isn't it? So there's an interaction that's going on between two people, and it just doesn't seem to work right. It's a lens that you can quickly apply and go, I think I know I think I might have an appreciation of what might be going on here.
Yeah. And one of the things that we talk about in transactional analysis is complementary transactions. And that's where there is a free-flowing, ongoing exchange of information, just like we're doing now. Now, to connect it to OD, sometimes what we want to do is to disrupt the transaction. And it encourages people to reframe what they're thinking, stop, pause. So when I think of being an OD practitioner, one of the things that I'm sometimes doing is I'm interrupting predetermined patterns of thinking or behaving or relating in the world to allow different ideas to emerge. And so, and it's done in what we call an okay way in transactional analysis. It's not me trying to catch someone out. What it is, it's inviting me to encourage the other person to think more broadly, to think differently, to have different ideas about what might be going on.
And as humans, we love patterns, don't we? And if it's a dysfunctional pattern, we very happily slip into one, don't we? And we stay in it as well. With the child as well, as there's different forms of child state. Is it like kind of good child, bad child, or am I reading this wrong?
Okay. Well, so yeah, without getting too much into depth, which would be difficult to do in a short podcast, the idea of ego states has actually developed extensively in 60 years. And in an organizational setting, one of the ideas that I like to use is something called functional fluency. And functional fluency has translated these ideas around what behaviors might we observe in the workplace. So, for example, within the child, we might connect what we call cooperative behavior, which is about okay exchanges of information, being assertive, dealing with challenges, etc. We talk about spontaneity, which is about where ideas and creativity come from. But equally well, we have an opposite for each of those. So the opposite of cooperative is compliant resistant, and the opposite of spontaneous is immature. Now, all of these behaviors show up in the workplace, but as a transactional analyst, one of the things that I might be looking for when I engage with a new client is, what proportion of these behaviors are showing up, that might give me a clue as to what might be going on here and how might people being showing up. There's one more really important thing I want to kind of emphasize here, though, is that transactional analysis very much started by looking at the internal world of individuals, the intrapsychic. And what is less known and less well appreciated is there's a huge part of transactional analysis which looks at systems. And so my transactional analysis is very much what I call systemic. So I will start with the system first. And Eric Berne wrote a book which looked at systems and he looked at cultures. And so the thing that I'm endlessly fascinated about is what is going on in the culture, what is going on in the system. And my standing frame of reference whenever I meet someone who's behaving in a particular way is how might the organization have informed how you've turned up today, rather than me pathologizing the individual and going, this is your pathology, this is your personality dysfunction. I go, something is going on in this organization, which means this individual might be playing a game or being overly dominant or being very sullen and compliant or whatever it might be. All of those are clues to me as to what might be going on in the system.
Oh, you've really whet the appetite. Danny, should we just clear all the rest of the questions out and then just go deep on that? Okay. And just one horribly simplifying question as well. Obviously, we're talking about individual to individual. Can you have it where groups, where you may have it where they're sort of playing the role of?
Well, this is the bit that I really love about transactional analysis, is that it gives lenses or maps to look individual to individual. It gives you lenses to look at groups or teams, which we would, in transactional analysis, we would call that imago. So it comes from the Latin word for image. And then we would also have ways of looking at culture or the whole system. So those two bits are much less well known. Like when you say transactional analysis, and if someone's heard of it, they've generally heard of ego states and parent, adult, child. They've very rarely heard of imago or the TA ideas on culture. But I operate up and down all of these ideas in every engagement or interaction where I'm working with an internal client.
I guess you've got different levels of intervention, haven't you, as well? So you might intervene at an individual level, group level, system level as well.
Absolutely.
Fascinating. So we'd love to understand a little bit about your journey into OD. So you came onto our radar because you're connected with lots of people that we've got a lot of respect for, actually. And then we started to follow your work, but we just looked at your history and it was just so fascinating. You work with some really iconic organizations in multiple roles. So how do you get to be where you are today, doing organization development for one of the big 5 technology companies in the world?
Well, I always joke about this. It's not like I was in my student guild bar in the University of Birmingham where I started my kind of academic journey going, I know one day I want to be an OD professional. Right? That
said no one ever.
No, said no one ever. Exactly. However, what I would say is that, so I do credit what happened at university for prompting my interest in this field of work. So I was elected as a student officer of my student guild. And the way that the student unions are structured in the UK, they often have permanent staff. And the permanent secretary of Birmingham University Guild of Students, who sadly has passed away now, but was like one of my inspirations, number one, a gentleman called Ian King. He happened to be doing a master's in strategic human resource management at Sheffield University. And I was like, and I had done a chemistry degree and I did not like chemistry and I knew I was not going to be a chemist. I thought, this sounds really interesting. So I then sought graduate training schemes in HR. I had a really interesting choice. It was either the NHS in Scotland, and I could have been assigned to a posting in Orkney, or to join Peugeot, the French car manufacturer. And I figured, well, if I go private sector, it's more flexible, but if I go public, I may never be able to get into private. That was the attitude in the 90s. I don't know how it is now. And after Peugeot, I moved to Cadbury. And at the time, Cadbury was a phenomenally run organization with an amazing HR function. And I happened in the early noughties, as was the case, to be put on a big change project, an enterprise software implementation. I mean, it sounds so quaint these days when you have everything in the cloud. This was on-premise, massive.
The days of big IT.
Yeah. These and I was put onto the change team. And honestly, I had no experience. I didn't know what I was doing. But Kevin Power was his name. So another very influential person. He's a an OD consultant I still stay in contact with these days. He was a mentor to me, and he introduced me at the ground level to how to think in systems and how to kind of construct a change management effort. And that was where I was hooked. I was like, this is the work I want to do. So I came to it by accident. But yeah, from that point onwards, then most of my career has been working either in OD or L&D. And I've had some generalist HR business partnering, but I've always come back to the OD in one form or another over my career.
We want to explore a bit more about the OD roles and how they developed over time. I guess just one question I just had there is, although you said you didn't necessarily enjoy chemistry, it still has a big influence on how you think and that. So has that had any kind of influence in terms of how you approached your practice?
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, I sometimes discount the importance of that. Yeah, so a science degree teaches you the rigor of thinking, the rigor of analysis, how to present information, how to integrate both tangible and unexplainable factors. So yeah, if I think back, it probably did have a big influence, although I really want to emphasize I was not a very good chemist. But yes, the degree did give me some influence on how I suppose my underpinning thinking works.
When did you start making the change? Because obviously there's a lot of people that work in change management but aren't doing OD. And when you do sort of see people that are doing change management in an OD way, it is different. So when did you start to make that transition, and how did you just discover OD in your work?
Yeah, well, I mean, once I started at Peugeot, I'm really showing my age now, the entry-level CIPD qualification then was called the PMFP, a Post-Management Foundation program. So that's what I went in to do. And then I carried on and I got a postgraduate diploma in HR, in industrial relations. So I kind of went in the classic HR route, didn't particularly learn OD then, if you like. So I think to answer your question, my understanding about what OD was emerged over time. I would say it was really the really pivotal time for me was when I moved to Singapore. And at the time, Cadbury was rolling out a big commercial strategy program. And that the way that program got rolled out was very well thought through. And it had a training component, an education component, but it also had an embedding component. So it's like, once you've trained people, how are you actually going to work with people to make sure this change sticks? So I started developing maturity models, which, you know, some people might say are a bit passé now, but back in the noughties, that was an acceptable way to do your work. And different ways to actually see how do you get these big business challenges to actually like land. And the biggest compliment I was paid at the time was, I cannot believe that you work in HR. You're like a business person. And I'm like, but that's my philosophy. That's my ethos. In Cadbury, it's like almost the first thing I was told, you are a business person first and an HR person second. And that philosophy, I think, is what's so important for OD work. It's like your client is the business or the system, and then you pull upon different functions to help you implement or make a difference or a change.
And you've worked at organizations like Britvic. You've then moved on to Google. So how sort of accepted was OD and its way of working into those organizations?
I would say so. Back in my consumer packaged goods days, so Cadbury and Britvic, I think at those times, I think consumer packaged goods were amongst the most advanced in their HR practices. So it was encouraged, in complete contrast to arriving at NBC Universal, where if I had said to, let's say, an executive producer, oh, I work at OD, it would have been met with a blank look. And there, I don't think I would have even explained my job title. I think I would have said, what is it you're trying to achieve? Let's see how I can help you achieve what it is. And sometimes people say, oh, you're like a coach or a consultant. Sometimes people might say, are you like some sort of organizational therapist? You know, people would try to put their language on what it was that I did. But yeah, so I've had experience both in organizations where OD was well known, well established, accepted, and organizations where they wouldn't even know what it is if it walked up and bumped them on the nose.
So you shifted gears and then you went to NBC Universal. What was the lure of that, and what was the task you were given? You were tasked with completing there.
So it was an interesting time because Comcast, which is a huge US cable TV company, had bought out General Electric's stake of NBC Universal. So the first thing it was we had to unhook all of GE's people processes, so performance management, talent management, learning and development, and then recreate them for NBC Universal. So, you know, a bit like a sort of I suppose, a demerger situation. And again, back in the noughties, GE's people processes were famed, you know, kind of really, really well known, really robust, really well designed, honestly. And, you know, they informed what we did. So that was the first part of the task. What came later in NBC Universal was about the development of a compelling employee proposition, so employee value proposition work. And then also a huge kind of process efficiency piece of work in one of their divisions as well, which, I mean, I would call it OD. They probably called it transformation or something like that. I mean, there's so many different words attached to this type of work.
So one of the things we love to do on the podcast is just unpack what OD looks like in reality, demystify it a bit and give people a really sense of what it is tangibly. So what does OD look like at Google? What does a typical day or a week look like for you?
I would say that the first thing is that it's around, the first question I ask is, what is it you're trying to achieve in the role that you sit in? So that's like the business kind of outcome. The very first question: where are you located in the organization? What is it you're trying to achieve? What external pressure or competitive pressure is placed upon you? What resources do you have to do that? What resource constraints are you under? So the very first step for me is, what even is the landscape that we're talking about here? So that's a kind of a sniffing out, sensing out what's going on. I might call that assessment, or you might call it diagnosis. I prefer assessment because diagnosis sounds too clinical. Then the next part of it is, what is the challenge? And it usually is a challenge, but sometimes it's an opportunity, and I am careful to balance those two. It's not always negative, although often the reason we're called is a negative. But I always want to check out, okay, what's the opportunity? What's the challenge that you're trying to deal with? And then usually based upon the opportunity or the challenge, there's some kind of further assessment, which might be talking to leaders, talking to the team as a whole, conducting a survey, engaging with the employees or the stakeholders, because that's possible as well, the stakeholders or the ecosystem that you're trying to assist. And those three steps are pretty standard. Only once I've understood the lay of the land and got a perspective on the problem. And by the way, I think that's a really important part of OD. I never take at face value what someone initially tells me about what the challenge is. I make very clear to anyone I'm working with, I need to investigate. That's really, really important, that you've asked me to come and help. I'm an independent outsider in this kind of work, so to speak. So one of the benefits of that is that I can come in with a fresh pair of eyes and look in a new way. And then there will be some kind of report back on what I've discovered, sometimes written, sometimes verbal, sometimes only to the leader and the HR business partner, sometimes to a leadership team, depends on, and then we might get into design and implementation. Right, what needs to happen next? What might a sequence of activities that would help you deal with whatever this challenge is? Yeah, so there's a fairly, and I always say this about OD, it's quite easy and abstract to explain it in some ways. It only really comes to life when you look at an actual case, and you follow a case through those kind of steps, if you like. Yeah.
I know. I've been doing it 18 years. My mum still thinks I make people cry for a living. But happy tears.
Yeah.
A question from me. So how do people invite you in to do the work? So how do you know there's a need in the business? How does that come about? Is there one route, or is it multiple ways?
There's multiple routes, actually. So the most common route would be from HR business partners in Google. And that's because they're across a huge range of topics. And they might hear something that's, usually the referrals I get are, there's something really tricky here. There's something intangible. There's something quite complex. I might be too close to it. Can you come and assist? So usually that's how it comes in. I do get some direct repeat business, so to speak, but like many organizations, the contracting model is with the people partner, because we sit within the people function. So yeah, usually the people partner, sometimes direct.
What might be some of the interventions that you do? I know obviously there's no two the same, but in what way do you sort of intervene?
Well, it's interesting. I think I'll first describe it in general terms and then give you a specific example. I think the thing that I do most commonly is slow people's thinking down enough to allow them to assess the situation more holistically. So one of my underpinning philosophies of doing OD is, it is not for me to provide the solution. The solution lies within you, but for whatever reason, you haven't got the capacity at the moment, or the tools or the resources to be able to define that solution yourself. So I'm always motivated by the first step being, right, let me help you have more resources to look at this situation, different ways to think about it. So sometimes I might offer a framework or a method or a tool or something that would help people think differently. Sometimes it's simply about letting people have space to explore something, because modern leaders are incredibly busy under huge amounts of pressure, and they're generally leaping from one thing to another. So I think sometimes they find it a relief to sit in a conversation for even half an hour and you say, we're going to explore this topic, and we don't need to nail it to the wall by the end of the 30 minutes. We're just going to explore it. That would be something that I would commonly do. I mean, often the way that we intervene would be workshops, team meetings, one-to-one leader interventions, playing feedback back. So there's a whole variety of, like, I would use every single one of those kind of combinations. Sometimes it's working one-to-one with the leader. Sometimes it's working with a leadership team. Sometimes it's working with a whole bunch of managers. Sometimes it's taking someone off to one side and giving them some feedback or intel that they did not know they needed in order to help them be more effective. Design is a big part of OD as well. So whenever there's an intervention with the client, there's always an element of design to it, whether it's designing a workshop, designing how you're going to feedback. So this week, literally, I've had 2 conversations after we surveyed a particular group in Google, 150 employees. We're asking them about culture, feedback culture, business process. And interestingly, we used Gemini, Google's AI, to help the first pass of the results. But then what we do is we finesse the results together and think, in what way, what's the most efficient and effective way to present this information back to produce the right sort of mindset that will allow people to respond to this feedback in a positive, like in a way that's going to move things forward rather than dragging us back. And so we really dug into not in any way sugarcoating the negative sentiment, but thinking, how do we produce the more, how do we position the more negative aspects of the feedback so that it can be responded to and doesn't just send people back to our earlier conversation, perhaps into childlike despair around, oh, nothing's ever going to change. Yeah,
that's really fascinating. And so it sounds like some interventions might have a TA approach and others may not. It all just depends.
Well, I am using TA whenever I work professionally. There are different schools of thought on this. The school of thought that I have is that I will share a TA idea if I think it will help the client. What I'm checking with myself, though, is, do I just want to use that TA idea because I like it? And then I check myself and go, right, well, they don't need to know it then, do they? But if I genuinely think, actually, if we use this TA idea or model or map to frame the problem and it will help them, then I will share it. So yeah, it's like my operating system professionally. It's always ticking away, but the formal sharing of it varies and is judicious. And in TA, we would call this psychoeducation. So it's like you do a short teach of something, always no more than 10 minutes. So someone gets the idea, and then generally the idea is accessible, so then they run with it. Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah. And I think like operates is a really lovely metaphor for that as well. And what's really interesting there, you're using sort of AI to sort of support the work and do a little bit of the heavy lifting as well, which is very progressive, isn't it? And it's something that, you know, is a potential opportunity for OD people to use more, particularly when you're managing vast amounts of data and try, because it's one thing to have data, but you've got to interpret it, translate it, and make it accessible as well, haven't you?
Yeah, and I, you know, I've only really started using AI seriously this year. And I mean, one of the reasons was that our developer models and our trainee models were not confidential. So I could not use confidential data around clients because it was accessible to the broader Google if they knew how to look in the code base. So I had to wait until we had like these discrete private models that we can use. Now that I have them, I find it's like training an apprentice. So I never take at face value what it spits out at me, but it is very good at combing large amounts of data and then producing something. And then I will look at the data and I'll say, I think you've overemphasized that point and underemphasized that point. Please rerun it. And then, I'm still experimenting, I'm still learning, but I think for OD professionals, generative AI is going to be big productivity and thinking enhancer. As long as you don't just blindly accept what it tells you, that would be a disaster. But you use it to supplement your thinking and supplement your processing, then I think it's amazing.
I'm really excited by it. Well, I think it's the and, isn't it? It's how can we use it to complement the work that we do, not fear being replaced by it. Because I don't think that doesn't feel like a threat to me at the moment. Yeah.
And that's for me where ethics come in. And within transactional analysis, ethics is a really important underpinning part of what we do. So we have a very strong ethical code that is systemic, and it looks at things like responsibility, protection, the client, and it looks across all stakeholder groups. So I would say in almost every engagement that I do, I'm also thinking ethics. And there's massive ethics with the use of AI as well. So it's kind of, I don't know that there's enough written in our profession about like the ethical stance in OD and what even is ethics, because ethics is not a rule book. Ethics, in my view, is subjective. It's a series of ways of thinking about a situation and then making trade-offs.
You're working in a fascinating industry, working for a fascinating organization, doing a fascinating job. What do you enjoy most about it, or OD in general?
I think what I enjoy most about it is it's when you can enable your client to do something that they otherwise would not have been able to do. And so in that sense, it's really interesting. OD is not it's not a profession for narcissists. If you want all the
Can we write that down? Hang on, we're going to write that. That's really good. It's true though. It's not about the ego, is it?
It's OD is a profession that's in service of. It's in service of the client. It's in service of the system. Some would say it's in service of society. So my joy comes from when I can see something has shifted for my client, and whatever they're trying to do has been shifted in their system as well. And I want to say, I don't always succeed, and nor do my clients. And so failure is also a big part of tolerating failure, and knowing that not all of your assignments will go as well as you might like is a big part of OD as well. So I can't say I love the failure, and failure I say in inverted commas. You can't have an absolute failure, but you can have an assignment that doesn't go as well as you'd hoped, where the change doesn't last as long as you might have thought, where the problem recurs. All of those things can happen, but I do enjoy that challenge. You've got to love the subjective in OD. And so back to one of your earlier questions around, I think the difficulty, if you've come from a very numeric, structured or process-driven discipline into OD, it's a really big jump in terms of philosophy or ethos about how you operate. And you have to let go of some things in order to then become an OD practitioner. And so I always say to people who are entering OD, whatever you do, your job is not to take notes. It is not your job to be the kind of the administrator of your client. Your job is to be present. And someone who's come from a very service-orientated type of role, they might think, that's a way I can be helpful. I can take notes. And I'm like, no, do not take notes. You disempower yourself. You make yourself less potent with the client. So so that's a piece of advice I would give to people looking to break into OD, is you've got to trust yourself and trust your presence with the client.
Great. I think that goes into list of the top 10 great tips we've heard on these podcasts so far. We really like that.
It doesn't mean you shouldn't produce written outputs, by the way. I want to really caveat that. Yes, of course, you need to do that. But anything that interrupts your presence when you're with the client, I would advise against.
But it's not as simple as not doing it though, because there's a very strong invitation to pick up the pen,
There
isn't
is.
there? There's a power dynamic at play, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
often it's like, so you're having to sort of stand your ground and know like what is your space and how you actually add value as well. And that's a different type of thing. They may not have had that relationship with sort of internal resource or external resource before.
It's very true. And if let's say I'm working with a leadership team and someone says around the leadership team, should we take notes of this discussion? And then there's silence.
The Mexican standoff, yes.
Yeah. And so I'll say, how are you as a team in terms of tracking and keeping like status on your work? And then if they go, well, that's actually one of the issues that we've got, then right, as a consultant, I must not step in and make up the deficiency for that client. They need to sort that out. They need to kind of to own it, if you see what I mean. So that would be a very practical illustration of it can actually be something that the client needs to address. And the OD practitioner stepping in and rescuing is very problematic, I think. And so avoiding, there's another aspect to that is, again, sometimes the other aspect of this is the OD practitioner as savior, the God complex. And if you ever get someone going, you're amazing, you're going to do fantastic work, whoa, huge warning bells. They are looking for a savior. You just happen to be the flavor of the month right now. Again, problematic. So cross that transaction, as we would say in transaction analysis, and say, what is it you think I'm going to save you from?
And it's
then
interesting because
stop.
Yeah, but it's so interesting because it's going back to the ego thing or the narcissist thing, isn't it? It's very easy to, when someone says that, to go, oh, well, that's very kind, thank you very much. But you're sort of almost removing yourself from it and being sort of observing what's actually happening, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah. And this comes back to the idea in transactional analysis of your adult ego state, where I've got all my resources, I'm grounded, I'm able to absorb what's going on. And I get it. Who doesn't like to be flattered? Who doesn't like to be told you're going to do an amazing job? It's like wonderful, but it's not your adult ego state that you're hearing that in. You're hearing it probably in your child ego state. And that's then where you respond from. And it's like, let me get back to adult. What's really going on here? Every transaction, as we would say, is a piece of data. Every single transaction. And even more importantly, that first 2 or 3 minutes with the client, they usually tell you most of what you need to know in the first 3 minutes. That's an idea from transactional analysis. So when I first meet a new client, I am hyper vigilant and hyper aware. What are they communicating to me? Both in the actual words that they share, but also psychologically, what are they communicating to me? And then generally, whatever they've shared in that first 3 minutes then tends to play out for the rest of the engagement in some way or another.
I've got a question I'm dying to ask, and you may or may not have an answer. So, how do you stay grounded? Like, how do you stay grounded in your profession? Because when the systems at play, these are very powerful forces, aren't they? They change behavior, they institutionalize people. They can push you out, even if you've got the strongest mandate in the world. How do you stay grounded in the moment? Do you have a repertoire, and how do you sort of stay true to yourself and what your mission or task is?
I mean, one thing I would say is that in the transactional analysis training that I've done, a huge amount of it was training us to recognize when we were in adult ego state and when we weren't. So every single program would start with a check-in. How much adult have you got available? If you haven't got adult available, what's going on? So it was a big part of my training, and that's like multiple years of training. The second thing is most people who follow a transactional analysis pathway will undertake some sort of therapy or counseling to help them notice themselves when they are getting in the way of their abilities as a practitioner. And so, I mean, in TA, we call that script. When script gets in the way, that would be some of our early conditioning and patterns that can surface today and then interrupt my ability to be present. So we're building that awareness through therapy. And then, and these are all longer term solutions. Supervision, super important. Really, I would say, I know the coaching profession is very focused on supervision, the OD profession less so, but I would say it's equally important. The perspective of another in helping you see what you can't see, because we cannot possibly see everything that we want to see in the moment. So that's why supervision is so valuable. especially regular supervision, because it's like, okay, I had this experience with the client, I go to my supervisor, I perhaps process it using Peter Hawkins' seven-eyed model, which is a really good systemic model of supervision that looks at lots of different dimensions. That's given me ideas about how I should intervene when I next go back to my client. In the moment, I would say it's things like breathing, moving, honestly, change of scenery, walking. Like you'll often see me in Google, I will walk around the block of the corridor before I have to go and do a difficult meeting or a difficult conversation. Something about the physical movement takes a matter of minutes, but can invite you into your adult ego state and therefore in a more able position to help your client.
What do you find most challenging about the work you do?
One thing would be when the client's got a great big hurry up. This is another TA idea. We call them drivers. They're patterns of behavior that can get formed when we're relatively young that help us get, well, in TA we call them strokes, but it's the way people get recognized. And so, and in organizations, you can get a culture of hurry up. Most modern organizations have a culture of hurry up because there's limited resources. So hurry up is always a challenge. I need this delivered now. Can you do it in a shorter amount of time? Can you do it in 2 weeks? Can you do it in 1 week? What can you do tomorrow? So I don't like that, but I recognize it's a feature of everyday life. So that's a challenge, is what if the client doesn't have enough adult about them to be able to slow down to do the work that they're being asked to? I think the other thing that would frustrate me is when there's an unrealistic expectation of how long it would take for a change to actually happen. And well, Garen, the CIPD event was talking about the very same thing. The kind of the realistic timeline for some changes can be 18 to 24 months. And no modern organization tolerates that, but it's the reality. So there's something for me as well that's frustrating when an organization expects a really big, significant change to happen in an incredibly short amount of time.
I think that will resonate with lots of people, lots and lots of people. How do you measure success in your role? So how do you look at what does success look like?
Oh, there's the holy grail question for our profession.
And that's why we keep asking it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's such a tricky question, because I think unpacking exactly what like my or my colleagues' interventions have contributed versus anything else is really, really challenging. So I have to say, actually, I come back to net promoter type of ideas. Did this intervention make the change to the client? Did this intervention produce the sort of change that you were expecting? And if they're at 9 or 10, then you know you've done an effective work. If you haven't, you know that's less so. So I would derive most satisfaction if I got a good net promoter score, because I would think, yeah, whatever I did, the leader's perspective on it was that it made a change. You can, we have experimented in Google with sending out questionnaires and surveys to leaders, but you know what leaders are like. They're incredibly busy. They probably won't answer it. And so the reliability of that data is quite low. So yeah, I have to say I probably am most on the kind of the verbal sense making of the leader after the intervention.
And what's some of the biggest lessons you've learned along the way? You've had a really rich and varied career of different sectors, different industries, different roles. What are some of the things that have really stayed with you, or even recent lessons?
One of the biggest lessons I've learned is less is more. So, and I can illustrate this practically. When you are preparing for your transactional analysis exams, you record yourself, just like coaches do. And I used to listen to recordings of me working in consults or with coaching sessions. And I used to have to stop and hold my head in my hand and go, shut up, James. You literally said what you needed to say in 5 or 6 words. And you then added another 4 sentences. It's like, so I think a real lesson for me is brevity is so impactful, as is space. And there's a real art to being able to inquire briefly, and then a real courage in shutting up and giving the client space. So that's a major career lesson. I think the other one that I would highlight would be around intercultural work, and which has been like informed in a kind of an intersectional way. I think of intercultural and DEI work are both really, really important. Sorry, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know there's all sorts of acronyms and different versions of letters with that. That's become much more present in OD work, I would say, in recent years. And for me, it's about a constant curiosity around what in TA we call frame of reference. What is the frame of reference of the client that I'm working with? And what is it they can and cannot see? What is it they do and don't appreciate interculturally? And this is, for me, a sort of this is a never-ending journey into cultural awareness. This year, I did my very first work with anyone from the Middle East region. Totally new arena for me. Going with your eyes wide open. I don't. Eric Byrne had this phrase, "Think Martian," and what he meant by it was, when you land in your client engagement, do your level best to empty your mind and look at it upon eyes as though you have no idea what's going on in this situation, because it will allow the freshest insights. Now, that's easier said than done, but this idea of thinking Martian is so helpful. I land in a new situation that I'm unfamiliar, empty my mind, and then notice where my biases come in and go, there's some data.
I love that. Brilliant. That's going to stick with me. Obviously, you've talked a lot about transactional analysis and the effort you've put into kind of developing yourself in that field. What does learning and development look like at the moment for you? Where are you focusing your efforts?
Yeah, so it's primarily in transactional analysis, in that once you've become a certified transactional analyst, if you decide to go on to become what is called a PTSCA, the Provisional Teaching and Supervising Transactional Analyst, there are certain requires about the number of hours of teaching, supervision, examining, evaluating written papers, presenting sessions at conferences, providing written articles. So a lot of my CPD is focused on all those different elements, and a lot of those get observed by a more experienced TA practitioner. So I have a never-ending stream of feedback, to be honest, from people who are very wise. And so I still feel like I'm being stretched incredibly. Outside of TA, I'm really interested in the ideas of Dave Snowden, and particularly a method that he's developing called estuarine mapping, which is a way of looking at complex systems and particularly the constraints and factors that are acting on systems. And I think he's really onto something, because in this world in which we operate, where there's so much unpredictability, the idea of constraints that we can influence and constraints that we can't, and all those side of things, really, really good. The only thing about Dave's work is it's quite academically dense, so you need to sit with it to kind of, translate it into pragmatic terms. But I enjoy the challenge, and I'm also looking to knit those ideas into TA as well. So that's one of the areas I want to write about.
And you followed the classic chemistry degree, NUS, automobile manufacturing, OD route.
Classic. Yes.
The old. We always want to ask the question is, for people that are actually considering a career in organization development, they either are considering it, they've seen it, they're frustrated with the way change happens in their organization, or they're just at the foothills. What advice would you give for someone starting out?
Well, I know 70-20-10 is much derided these days, but as a metaphor, I think it's still pretty sound. And I would recommend to anyone thinking about getting into OD, seek out a change project. That is where you will cut your teeth. And there are change projects running all the times in organizations. So, and particularly any change project that requires collaboration with different functions. So as soon as you have to knit together different parts of the business, IT, finance, legal, HR, commercial, whatever it is, get involved in a project of that nature and keep volunteering for those projects, because that will give you really valuable experience about what does and doesn't work in change, which is in essence what OD is. OD is about promoting a change in the system for the good of the system. So that would be the practical experience that I would say, if you're right at the beginning of starting out, is find a change project to volunteer on. I think the CIPD does a foundation certificate or similar in OD. You probably know better than I, Darren, but doing something like that to get your formal OD underpinning would be really helpful as well. And then hopefully between those two things, then you could start to find different ways to get in. And final top tip is, if you are in HR, I think there are often change jobs that are in business functions that are given a different name. So also consider going for one of those types of jobs to give you a different experience and to really experience the accountability of driving a change.
James, I want to say a huge thank you. This conversation has been a bit like when you go to a restaurant and you want to eat every single thing off the menu. I feel like we're just scratching the surface. There's just so many interesting things you've shared with us. There's so much you've shared with us in terms of transactional analysis and the rigor that follows. Give us some brilliant insights into how you create meaningful and significant change in organizations like Google, and really sort of started to reveal a little bit of detail in terms of how you actually work on the ground and how you stay grounded as well. I guess some of the takeaways I'm taking away. So we're only allowed 3 each. So, so I'm going to be really disciplined here. So I just some really nice things there. The fact that OD is not a profession for narcissists, I think that's something it's really important, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like if you're seeking the limelight and glory, your satisfaction comes from a different place, doesn't it? In this, I think that's a really important thing to kind of know up front. Dan, I might be stealing yours, but I've got less is more. That ability to feel comfortable, and it resonated with me because obviously when you do the transcripts from your own sessions and you type them up, and then it kind of is just typed into your own head how much. So it just letting the scientists do the heavy lifting as well. And then the final thing is think Martian, which is the ability just to to come in and though you may know, how do you sort of bring that kind of different kind of perspective as well. Danny, what stood out for you?
Yeah, you definitely still think Martian. I was going to say that, but I'll let you have that. So I think something you said really early on about kind of the importance of kind of thinking how when we're interacting with a leader or a team, thinking about how the system is impacting them. So really having that systemic lens when we go into a situation. I think our ability as OD practitioners to tolerate failure is so important, because we're working with messy, complex humans and messy, complex systems, so we can't know and we can't get it right all the time. So tolerating failure. And I loved what you said about the first 2 or 3 minutes with a new client are so important to might tell us everything we need to know and give us. So I'm going to pay particular attention to the next 2 or 3 minutes every time I meet a new client. So
if people want to follow your work, if they want to reach out to you, they want to understand a little bit more about transactional analysis, and I know obviously you're moving into supervision now, so how can people reach out to you?
Yeah. So primarily through LinkedIn. I'm employed at the moment. It's been a project that I want to set up my own website, but I haven't done it yet. So please contact me through LinkedIn. Regularly run what's called a TA 101, which is the officially endorsed introduction to transactional analysis. And TA has a philosophy that that's a low cost product. So it's very accessible. And we also provide discounts as well whenever people request them because of extenuating circumstances. We do not want finances to be a reason for not being able to access TA. So yeah, contact me for a TA 101. I'll be running them both virtually and hopefully one in London as well. I also offer supervision to organizational development consultants, and I also offer what's called a 202, which is a more advanced program for those that have done the 101, where it's a kind of a combination of learning TA ideas and supervision on those ideas. So people should feel free to contact me via LinkedIn for any of those aspects.
Wonderful. And whether you're listening to this on audio or you're watching the video, audios, we'll put all of the links that James has shared with us in the show notes as well. So please follow up with James. We'd really appreciate it if you did that too. So James, I want to just say a huge thank you. We're putting you into the collection with these other amazing OD practitioners that are doing brilliant things in the field, and we've really enjoyed it. It's absolutely delivered on the things that we wanted to do when we set the podcast up. So thank you for being so generous with your practice. Thank you for being so generous with your insights into transactional analysis and so on. If you'd be happy for doing a round 2 in the future, I think we'd love to have you back.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, and thank you so much for the invite. You reach a stage in your career where people think it's worth recording what you've got to say, then that's an honor and quite humbling. So thank you.
And a 2-parter.
Well, yes, even more so. Yeah.
Brilliant. So for those of you that are watching, I hope we've earned your like. And please subscribe to the channel wherever you're listening or watching this, so then you're up to date with all the latest recordings that we've got coming out. We're literally releasing an interview every single week on Mondays at 7:30 for video and Fridays at midday on audio as well. So thank you so much, and thanks for your time, everyone.